SITREP World Briefing for June 19, 2026. Israel launched heavy strikes across southern Lebanon on June 19 after the Israeli military said 4 soldiers were killed in combat near Kfar Tebnit, Lebanon. The deaths, reported as the first Israeli military losses since a truce was meant to be in place, came as Hezbollah fighting flared again along the border, and Lebanese authorities said Israeli attacks killed 18 people in the south the same day. Israeli officials said the 4 troops were killed when a tank was hit during an operation near Kfar Tebnit in southern Lebanon, while Lebanon said the Israeli response included broad strikes in southern districts. Southern Lebanon has remained one of the most combustible fronts in the region because Israeli forces, Hezbollah units, and nearby civilian communities are packed into a narrow border zone where a single attack can rapidly trigger wider retaliation. The renewed violence also complicated the diplomatic narrative that the U.S.-Iran deal would calm secondary theaters, including Lebanon. Both Israeli and Lebanese reporting on June 19 pointed to the same central reality. After a truce that was supposed to reduce hostilities, fighting near Kfar Tebnit and Israeli bombardment in the south continued almost immediately afterward. For Lebanon, where state authority in the south is already constrained by Hezbollah's military role and by years of economic collapse, another cycle of strikes risks fresh displacement and deeper pressure on a government that has struggled to keep the border from sliding back into sustained war. Militants from Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, or JNIM, attacked Niger's main airport and a nearby military airbase in Niamey, Niger, on June 19, striking the capital in one of the insurgency's most high-profile assaults in months. The reported death toll was 35, comprising 11 soldiers, 2 civilians, and 22 attackers, according to the 2 accounts, after Nigerian forces fought back around the airport complex. The assault hit critical infrastructure in Niamey, where the airport is both a civilian gateway and a strategic military site. JNIM, West Africa's al-Qaeda affiliate, claimed responsibility for the operation, linking the attack directly to the regional militant campaign that has destabilized Niger and its neighbors for years. Niger has been battling an Islamist insurgency for about a decade, and the choice of target was especially significant because suspected jihadists had already attacked the same airport in January. By hitting both the airport and the adjacent airbase in the capital, the attackers signaled an intent to disrupt transport military operations, and the authorities claimed to control Niamey. The attack also highlighted the broader security crisis facing Niger's military rulers as they try to contain threats from jihadist groups operating across the Sahel. An assault inside Niamey carries political weight because the capital is the center of government, military command, and foreign diplomacy, and attacks there can reverberate far beyond the immediate battlefield. With JNIM publicly claiming the operation and the casualty breakdown showing heavy losses on both sides, the June 19 raid is likely to intensify scrutiny of Niger's counterinsurgency strategy and the protection of urban infrastructure. The United States and Iran said they had reached an agreement to end military operations in the Middle East, with Geneva, Switzerland, identified as the site for a planned signing ceremony tied to the deal. The agreement included the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway critical to global energy shipments and regional commerce. Iranian officials said President Donald Trump accepted the terms under pressure, while U.S. Democrats criticized the agreement, and analysts noted that both governments were already struggling to defend the same document to very different domestic audiences. Geneva offers neutral diplomatic ground for adversaries that have lacked sustained direct trust, but a ceremony alone cannot settle the disputes over enforcement, interpretation, and what each side actually conceded to stop the fighting. Internationally, the accord was welcomed as a step toward restoring trade and navigation, especially because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most sensitive maritime choke points. Singapore's government said the reopening would help create conditions for peace, security, and stability, reflecting wider concern among trading states that even a short war in the Gulf can disrupt shipping, insurance costs, and fuel markets far beyond the region. The agreement's durability will depend on whether Washington and Tehran can turn a war-ending text into a functioning political arrangement that survives pressure from rivals, legislatures, and military establishments on both sides. The United States and Iran called off follow-up negotiations that had been planned for June 19th in Switzerland, interrupting an effort to turn the framework understanding signed a day earlier into a longer-term arrangement. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance also canceled his trip for the talks, leaving the diplomatic track paused after both governments had presented the earlier agreement as a step toward winding down the Iran war and opening the door to more detailed bargaining. The postponement came as the Trump administration faced criticism from both Democrats and Republicans. Switzerland has long served as a neutral venue for adversaries that lack normal diplomatic relations, so the collapse of a meeting there is significant. It means the two sides lost an early chance to lock in procedures, sequencing, and confidence-building steps that often determine whether a fragile opening can endure. For Tehran and Washington, the cancellation does not erase the framework deals signed on Wednesday, but it does raise the cost of restoring momentum. In practical terms, the pause leaves unanswered how the sides would move from broad promises toward enforceable commitments, timelines, and verification mechanisms in any future round. Andy Burnham won the parliamentary by-election in Makerfield on Friday, giving the veteran Labour politician a route back to Westminster. Burnham, who had spent years as mayor of Greater Manchester, defeated Reform UK candidate Rob Kenyon in the Northern England contest. The result strengthens the case for a challenge to Starmer at a moment when his standing has fallen since leading Labour into government. Securing a common seat removes a major practical barrier to any move against a sitting Prime Minister, and an emphatic by-election win gives him a fresh mandate from voters in one of Labour's traditional heartlands. In Britain's parliamentary system, leadership credibility depends heavily on command in Westminster, and Makerfield has now supplied Burnham with that platform. Makerfield matters beyond its single seat because by-elections in England often become early tests of a governing party's authority and of the opposition forces pressing in from both the left and the populist right. Burnham's return to Westminster after his period in Manchester government also reintroduces a figure with executive experience, a recognizable national profile, and an independent political base. European Union leaders meeting in Brussels, Belgium, on Thursday, backed stronger trade defenses to respond to what the bloc sees as a surge in Chinese exports threatening European industry. The leaders agreed on the need for tougher protective tools while still maintaining what they described as a constructive dialogue with Beijing, reflecting the EU's effort to balance market access, industrial protection, and broader diplomatic ties with China. The discussion in Brussels centered on whether the 27-member bloc needs stronger defenses to curb rising Chinese export flows that officials believe could undercut manufacturers and put jobs at risk across Europe. That debate has become more urgent as Brussels tries to protect strategic sectors without closing off trade entirely, especially at a time when the EU is under pressure to strengthen competitiveness, preserve industrial capacity, and avoid deeper dependence on subsidized foreign production. Brussels has spent recent years expanding anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, and other defensive instruments. And the latest move signals that EU governments want the European Commission to act more assertively if Chinese export dominance is seen as distorting competition inside the single market. At the same time, the emphasis on continued dialogue with Beijing suggests leaders are still trying to prevent an outright trade rupture with one of Europe's largest commercial counterparts. The United States and Iran reached a peace deal on June 19th, ending hostilities that had shaken energy production and transport routes across the Middle East since the conflict began on February 28. The immediate market effect was a retreat in fuel and gas prices after recent spikes tied to fears over disrupted supplies, tanker movements, and refinery operations. Because the Middle East remains central to global crude exports and liquefied natural gas flows, even a limited reduction in military risk can feed quickly into wholesale energy pricing, shipping costs, and consumer expectations far beyond the region, including in Europe and the United Kingdom. The agreement matters for households and businesses because oil and gas costs filter through transport, freight, heating, electricity generation, and prices paid at the pump. In the United Kingdom, petrol and diesel costs had jumped after the war disrupted the production and transportation of energy across the Middle East. Markets will still watch whether the deal holds in practice, because traders typically price not just current output, but also the risk of future disruption around pipelines, export terminals, and major sea lanes that connect Gulf producers with global buyers. For policymakers, the peace deal is significant because energy inflation has been one of the fastest ways for conflict in the Middle East to spread into the wider global economy. Lower wholesale fuel and gas prices can reduce pressure on central banks, airlines, manufacturers, and consumers, although any relief usually reaches retail markets with a delay. The United States and Iran have therefore influenced not only regional security, but also the near-term outlook for inflation and household budgets. Sources and the full written briefing are available at sitrepbrief.com.